The people of Dunmore, Alberta, said a lot of things about Eli Morrow. They said he was strange. They said he'd been broken somewhere overseas and never quite put himself back together. They said a man who spent 3 years welding steel plates onto the walls of a barn, an old, half-rotted barn at the top of a ridge nobody else wanted, was a man who had lost his grip on what was real. Eli had heard all of it. He didn't argue. He just kept welding. The barn sat at the edge of his 5 acres, up where the hill flattened into a long shelf of wind-scoured rock before it dropped away toward the valley. The view from up there on a clear day was the kind of thing that made you understand why settlers had stopped moving west when they reached Alberta. You could see 50 kilometers in 3 directions. To the north, the foothills went pale and blue at their farthest edge. To the east, the flatland stretched so far it curved with the earth. To the west, the Rockies sat low and permanent on the horizon, like something older than weather. Eli had bought the property 12 years ago, 3 months after he came back from his last tour. He'd driven up from Calgary in a truck that needed a new transmission. And when he'd pulled off the county road and walked the ridge for the first time, he'd stood there for a long time without moving. His dog, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Rook, had stood beside him with his ears up, reading the wind. That was enough. Eli had made the call that afternoon. He was 63 years old now. His hair had gone the color of creek ice in February. He walked with a slight forward lean that anyone who'd carried a pack across rough country for 2 decades would recognize. Not a limp exactly. More like a man who was always just slightly ready to move. His hands were thick and scarred. One knuckle on his left hand, permanently swollen from something that had happened in a place he didn't talk about. When he smiled, which wasn't often, it changed his whole face. People who only knew him from a distance were sometimes startled the first time they saw it. Rook was 9 now, and the black in his muzzle had softened to gray, but he still moved like a dog who expected the world to require something of him at any moment. He slept inside on a pad near the wood stove. He ate twice a day, worked the property perimeter every morning without being asked, and sat beside Eli every evening when Eli read by the lamp. They had understood each other from the first week. That kind of understanding between a man and a dog doesn't happen often. When it does, it doesn't need explaining. The people in Dunmore mostly left Eli alone, which was how he preferred it. He drove down once a week for supplies. He nodded at people in the hardware store. He had a coffee twice a month at the diner on Main Street, usually with a man named Carver, who ran the grain elevator and never asked questions that weren't worth answering. Eli appreciated that about him. What Eli did on the ridge, what took him years of quiet, deliberate work, was something the town had decided early on was either foolish or alarming, and they couldn't quite agree on which. He had converted the old barn, not renovated it, not repurposed it, the way people used old barns for weddings or antique storage. He had reinforced it from the inside out, steel-framed the walls, poured a new concrete floor with radiant heating underneath, fed by a wood-fired boiler that could run on anything that would burn. He'd buried a 5,000-liter water cistern 40 meters from the structure and connected it with insulated lines that wouldn't freeze at -40. He'd built a ventilation system with filters. He'd installed a backup generator and a solar array on the south-facing slope below the ridge, discreet enough that you wouldn't notice it from the road. He had a root cellar cut into the hillside behind the structure, stocked with preserved food and medical supplies, organized with the same precision he'd once applied to mission planning. He'd done most of it himself, over 10 years, a little at a time. Some of it he'd hired out to a contractor in Lethbridge, who asked no questions and submitted no inspections. The town knew only pieces of it, enough to talk. Old Morrow's building a bunker up there, someone had said once, in the hardware store, loud enough for Eli to hear from the next aisle. Some kind of doomsday thing. Ellie had set a box of lag bolts on the counter without comment. There had been a time early on when his daughter had tried to talk to him about it. Natasha lived in Edmonton now, taught high school history. had 2 kids and a husband who worked in insurance. She was a thoughtful woman, careful with her words, and she'd driven down one September weekend and walked the property with him and tried, gently, to ask what he was building and why. "Dad," she'd said, standing in front of the reinforced doors, "what is this for?" He'd thought about it. He'd looked at the valley below, at the town sitting quiet in its bowl of hills, at the sky to the northwest where it was already starting to pile into something gray and textured. "What it's always for," he'd said. She'd nodded slowly, the way she did when she decided not to push. They'd had dinner together that night, and she'd driven back to Edmonton in the morning. She called him every Sunday. That was enough. People in Dunmore had their own names for what Eli was building. The bunker, the Morrow fortress. One man at the coffee shop had called it the craziest thing he'd ever seen on a working property, which suggested he hadn't seen much. The woman at the post office called it a waste of a good barn. The new township councillor had referred to it once, at a public meeting, as a concerning use of rural land, though when someone asked him to be more specific, he'd been unable to. Eli let them talk. He'd learned in the army that people need to name what they don't understand, and that naming it is usually the end of their interest. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. Their interest was just waiting for a reason. The winter of that year came early to southern Alberta, which should not have surprised anyone who'd been paying attention. October had been dry and warm, the kind of warmth that accumulates a debt. November was cold but settled. Then in the 3rd week of December, the forecast that meteorologists had been hedging about for 2 weeks stopped hedging. The system that came down from the northwest was not ordinary. It had been building over the Pacific for 10 days, gathering moisture, gathering cold, pulling energy from a pattern that hadn't appeared over Western Canada in 40 years. The Environment Canada alerts that came out on a Tuesday were categorized at the highest level. Schools in Lethbridge closed. The Trans-Canada shut down between Medicine Hat and the Saskatchewan border. The RCMP issued a statement that was, for a government document, unusually direct. Stay indoors, stay off the roads, have enough supplies for at least 5 days. Dunmore had 400 people. A volunteer fire department, 1 ambulance based in a town 20 minutes away in good weather, and a power grid that ran on lines strung on poles that had last been replaced in the early 90s. The storm arrived on a Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, the temperature outside was -42 with the wind chill. The snow had been falling for 14 hours and was not slowing. The power had gone out in most of the town at 3 a.m. when a transmission line somewhere north of town came down under ice load. The backup from the southeast grid lasted another 4 hours before that line went too. Dunmore went dark. Eli had been watching the forecast for a week. He'd made 1 extra supply run on the Monday, not because he needed much. He rarely did, but because he wanted to check on a few things in town. He'd noticed, without comment, that the shelves at the grocery store were thin, that the gas station had a line of trucks he didn't recognize, people passing through who'd decided to stop, that 2 of the 3 propane suppliers in the area had posted sold-out signs. He'd driven back up to the ridge, brought Rook inside, stacked 3 extra cords of split spruce against the leeward wall of the structure, and gone to bed. When the storm hit, he was ready. He'd been through worse. Not in Alberta, in other places, other kinds of cold, other kinds of dark. The kind of readiness he had wasn't about fear. It had never been about fear. It was about something simpler and more honest. He knew what the world could become, and he had decided, deliberately and without drama, to be prepared for it. That was all. The town was not prepared. By Thursday afternoon, the temperature inside most of Dunmore's homes had dropped to the point where families were piling into single rooms, burning whatever they had. A hardware store owner had broken open his back stock of propane heaters and was selling them off at cost. The diner on Main Street, which had a gas range that still worked, had opened its doors and was running a makeshift warming center out of its front room. 30 people were sitting in a space meant for 40, and the gas pressure was dropping. At the Legion Hall, 2 older men were trying to get a wood stove going. But the chimney hadn't been cleaned in 3 winters, and the smoke was backing up. The fire department had 2 calls in the first 6 hours. 1 carbon monoxide alarm, 1 chimney fire. The ambulance had tried to come from Redcliffe, but had turned back at the county road, where the drifts were running 2 meters high. Eli heard none of this directly. His radio told him most of it. He sat by his own stove with Rook beside him, the structure warm and steady around them, and he listened to the volunteer fire channel and the municipal emergency frequency. He wrote down what he heard. He thought about the math. How many households? How many people without reliable heat? How many hours before it became dangerous? He put on his gear at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It took him 20 minutes to dress for what was outside. He was methodical about it. The way he was methodical about everything. He checked Rook's harness, checked the saddlebags he'd sewn onto it 2 winters ago. One side carried a compact first-aid kit, the other a small thermal pack. He loaded a sled with supplies. Medical kit, 3 propane canisters, 6 heavy blankets still in their vacuum seals. Food, enough for a dozen people for 2 days. A hand crank radio, a length of climbing rope and a set of anchors. He opened the door. The wind hit him like a wall. Rook went through the door without hesitation. The dog had been in cold before. He tucked his head slightly into the wind and moved forward, and Eli followed, pulling the sleds behind him. The half-kilometer down to the county road took 40 minutes. The drifts across the path were inconsistent. In some places, the ridge geometry had scoured the ground nearly bare. In others, the snow was packed to his hip. Rook moved ahead, testing the crust, and twice he stopped and waited for Eli to read what the dog had read. They had a system. They understood each other. When they reached the county road, Eli turned toward town. The first people he reached were in a farmhouse 300 meters from the road. A family named Pryor. A woman in her late 30s, her mother, and 2 kids under 10. The farmhouse had an old oil furnace that had lost pressure, and the temperature inside when Eli knocked was 8 degrees. The children were bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, and sitting against the only interior wall, their breath visible. Rook went in first. The children knew him from somewhere. They must have seen him in town, and they reached for him immediately, and Rook let them put their hands in his fur without moving. Eli got the propane heater running in 10 minutes. He left them a blanket, half the food, a radio set to the emergency channel, and his instructions: stay together in one room, keep low, don't open doors unnecessarily. He went back into the storm. The next 2 hours were like that. A couple in their 70s on a side road, who had no heat at all, and who had been debating whether to try to drive somewhere, which would have been fatal. A man alone in a house trailer, who had a chest condition and wasn't getting enough air, his heater burning improperly. Eli recognized the symptoms, corrected the venting, made sure the man's oxygen levels were stable enough before he moved on. Rook moved through all of it with the particular calm of a dog who is working. Not frantic, not cautious, purposeful. At the trailer, while Eli was working inside, Rook had stayed at the door, which had been left slightly ajar. Later, Eli would realize the dog had been monitoring the wind direction, had been watching for the shift that might block the ventilation on the other side of the structure. When the wind changed, Rook made a sound, one short bark, and Eli had gone to check and found exactly what the dog had indicated he would find. By the time Eli reached the edge of town, near the gas station, he was pulling an empty sled. The supplies were distributed. He stood in the lee of the building and looked at the town through the driving snow and thought about what was still needed. His radio crackled. The diner. The warming center at the diner was running low on gas pressure. 43 people inside now. 2 of them had medical conditions. The gas might last 2 more hours, and after that the temperature in the room would drop fast. He thought about the math again. Then he got on the radio himself. This is Eli Morrow, on the East County Road. I have capacity at my property on the ridge. Heat, water, food, space for 30 people minimum. If anyone has a vehicle that can run, I can walk back up and have the access road cleared in 2 hours. Someone needs to make the calls to move people. There was a pause. He understood the pause. He knew what they thought of him, and what they thought of the ridge and what they had called the place he'd built. He had heard all of it. Then the voice of the volunteer fire chief came back on the channel. "Copy that, Morrow. We'll start organizing." He walked back up to the ridge. Rook walked beside him. The wind was worse now, coming from the northwest in long sustained pushes, and the cold had deepened. Eli knew what it felt like when the temperature dropped past the point where exposure time was measured in minutes rather than hours. He'd felt it before, in other latitudes, in other kinds of dark. He got the tractor running. He had a blade on the front of it, and it took him 90 minutes to clear the access road from the county road to the ridge, pushing the drifts to either side, making 2 passes to widen it enough for the fire department's truck. The first vehicle came up at 8 o'clock that night, then more. The structure on the ridge had never held more than Eli and Rook, but Eli had built it to hold more, because that was how he thought. Because he had spent 22 years in an organization where you planned for the worst and built in the margin and never assumed you were the only person your preparation would ever need to serve. It held 41 people that night. The wood stove ran continuously. The radiant heat in the floor kept the concrete warm underfoot. The water lines didn't freeze. The preserved food, 3 years of careful accumulation, fed everyone who was hungry. The generator kept a small string of lights burning and charged people's phones. Rook moved through the space with a kind of deliberate quietness, going from person to person, sitting with the ones who were most frightened, which was usually the children. A 5-year-old girl whose name Eli never caught fell asleep with her hand in Rook's fur and stayed that way for 4 hours. The counselor who had called the property a concerning use of rural land was there. He sat near the back wall and said nothing for a long time. Eventually, he ate some food and asked if there was anything he could do. Eli gave him a task, monitoring the water temperature on the cistern output and calling out if it dropped below a certain number. The man did it carefully and reported back every 30 minutes through the night, more precisely than Eli had expected. The woman from the post office was there. She cried when she first came in out of the cold, and then she helped organize the food for the people who arrived after her. Carver, the man from the grain elevator, arrived at midnight in his own truck. He'd driven through drifts that should have been impassable. He walked in, looked around, looked at Eli and said, "You could have told me. You could have asked," Eli said. Carver laughed once, a short sound. Then he took off his coat and started helping. Rook, sometime in the middle of the night, found a man in his late 50s sitting alone near the door. The last place anyone would choose to sit, with the cold radiating off the steel. He was a man Eli knew slightly, from the hardware store, a man who tended toward silence, and who had moved to Dunmore recently from somewhere else. He was sitting with his hands clasped and his eyes fixed on something that wasn't in the room. Rook sat down beside him, didn't make a sound, just sat there, close enough that the man could feel the warmth of the dog against his leg. After a while, the man put his hand on Rook's back. After a while longer, he raised his head and looked around the room. He was still quiet, but he was present again. Wherever he'd been, he'd come back. Eli saw it from across the room and said nothing. The storm lasted 56 hours. When it was over, the temperature outside climbed back above -20, and then above -10, and eventually, 2 days later, to something a person could walk in without special equipment. The power came back in stages. The main grid first, then the side roads. The ambulance from Redcliffe got through on the Saturday afternoon. No one died. The doctor who came up from Lethbridge on the Sunday said that was not a given, considering the temperatures and the duration and the condition. He said it specifically, using numbers and medical language, and people listened and nodded. But everyone in Dunmore already knew what it meant. They'd been in it. In the weeks that followed, people said things about Eli Morrow that were different from the things they'd said before. Not loudly, Not all at once, but one at a time in the hardware store, at the diner, at the gas station, the way small towns process things, through accumulation rather than announcement. Eli didn't hear most of it. He wasn't in town much. He was busy with the property, checking the water system, restacking the wood supply, going through the medical kit, and replacing what had been used, making a list of what he needed to reorder. He was doing what he always did, which was prepare for the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and readiness was not a project you finished. Natasha called on Sunday, as she always did. He told her about the storm. Not all of it. He gave her the general shape, the temperatures, the power outage, the people from town who'd come to the ridge. There was a silence on the line. You had room for 40 people, she said. 41, he said. Another silence. Then, Dad. That was all she said. But he heard everything in it. The years of not quite understanding, and the moment of understanding arriving, and the particular relief that comes when you finally see that someone you love has known something all along that you had simply needed time to see for yourself. I know, he said. After he hung up, he sat by the stove. Rook's head was in his lap. The fire made its small sounds behind the glass of the door. Outside, the valley was still and white. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has taken everything and left the air spent and clean. The ridge was the same as it had always been. The structure stood at the top of it, weathered and reinforced and deliberately unglamorous, the way things built to last always are. Rook's eyes were closed. His breathing was steady and even the way it was when he was most at ease, which was always here, on the ridge, in the quiet, with Eli nearby. Eli didn't need anything to be said about any of it. The ridge was enough. The work was enough. The fact of it, 41 people who'd come in out of the cold, who'd eaten and slept warm, and gone home to their families. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole point.